As I've been reflecting on the feedback I've gotten from other mental health professionals about this video project, I did that thing that always brings me some sense of comfort. I started reading. Specifically, I started reading more about the state of mental health among professional caregivers, like therapists and psychologists and social workers and counselors. From my own experience, and from what I've heard my colleagues talk about at workshops and symposiums and conferences and retreats and happy hours and sometimes even bottles of wine in my living room, I know that so many mental health professionals face some kind of diagnosable struggle at some point in their lives. I even put some numbers to it in a prior video. I came across an article from way back, from June of 1997. And in terms of articles for reference, that might as well be the Dark Ages. But an interesting thing stuck out to me. Even 26 years ago, before social media took hold, before COVID, before the current rise in Christian nationalism, before the current extreme political divides, before so-called reality TV set the standards for how we view our successes, before lots of things, even way back then, an estimated 81% of mental health professionals faced some form of diagnosable mental illness at some point in their careers. Honestly, that number doesn't surprise me. Given what we know about the prevalence rates in the general population, it makes sense to me that people who do hard and heavy emotional work are going to struggle. What shocked me in this article was the notion that we do a poor job of monitoring our own mental health to the point that the main responsibility for spotting an impaired therapist seemed to fall on the patient, the client who is there dealing with their own shit. And this is the person who is most likely to notice and say something to the therapist. Yikes. All this mental unhealth and mental unrest within this profession leads to some pretty high rates of burnout. A study by the American Psychological Association found that 45% of clinicians reported feeling burned out within the prior 12 months. Another study found that 78% of psychiatrists reported burnout, and that the average rate of burnout before COVID was as high as 61% for some segments of the mental health helping profession. Now, I'm going to disclose I know more than a little about professional burnout. About 10 years ago, I wrote a chapter in this edited book series all about burnout, understanding the mechanism for employee burnout subsequent to recurrent stress in the workplace. Of course, books and edited series like this written for professionals have long-ass boring titles. I'm not new to research and understanding burnout. But what about when we apply burnout to things other than work? When I wrote my chapter, I talked about the lack of a good definition of burnout. Let me share what I wrote. There is no readily agreed upon definition of burnout. As a metaphor, burnout refers to the smothering of a fire when there is a lack of sufficient resources to keep the flame burning. Over time, employees lose the capacity to provide meaningful contributions and they accomplish less and less. To complete the metaphor, burnout is an exhaustion of an employee's capacity to maintain productivity, flickering of the candle, and eventual lack of positive or productive impact in the workplace. The flame dies out. It was noted that the concept of burnout, which was identified as being brought to the collective consciousness when that very term in the novel A Burnt Out Case, has been a well-known, though relatively undocumented, social construct for years. Though the source was initially thought of as a pop psychology book, they stated that the term entered our vernacular thanks to its remarkably descriptive account of the workplace experience. So I wrote that 10 years ago, and at the time it was applied specifically to work. But let's go with a simpler definition of burnout. I'm going to refer to burnout as a state of emotional, mental, and possibly physical exhaustion brought on by prolonged and repeated stress. Like I said, usually it's thought of in terms of work, but really it can show up anywhere in your life, like parenting, caretaking, social obligations, and even romantic relationships. All of those, except parenting, have been burnout markers for me for sure. And how would I have known I was burned out in some way, not about work? Well, I could have listened to my body. There are usually some physical signs: headaches, fatigue, heartburn or acid reflux, other gastrointestinal symptoms, high blood pressure, insomnia, muscle aches, sexual problems, cardiovascular problems. I knew all that. Fuck, I wrote about all that a decade ago. And in hindsight, I've experienced a lot of those physical symptoms. Not all, but a lot. And then there's the psychological symptoms: depression, anxiety, sense of dread, anger, frustration, irritability, attention and concentration problems, memory lapses, maybe even some dissociative moments, avolition, a fancy term for lacking motivation to do anything, substance misuse, food misuse. Yep, I knew all those too because, well, I researched and wrote about it. And yeah, had a lot of that happen to me. But for whatever reason, I didn't think about it as burnout outside of work. I've talked before about my burnout with work. I just didn't think to conceptualize other aspects of my life that way. But now it makes perfect sense. Anything that comes with chronic stress or adherence to stereotypes or stigma can lead to burnout. Anytime we're chronically exhausted, detaching from people or responsibilities, anytime we're withdrawing from aspects of our lives, well, we should think about it as burnout. That could be it. Of course, as I said before, mental health professionals aren't great at self-monitoring. So it does make sense that I didn't see all these other life stressors as burnout symptoms and even actual causes of burnout. Fortunately, I wasn't tipped off to my burnout by a patient. From what I can tell, most of my clients have no idea that this is even on my radar, and I'm quite thankful for that. But it means expending greater energy at my job that I don't have for other areas of my life. Basically, it's exhausting to maintain this facade for people, and it zaps me of the energy I need for other areas of my life. As a published expert on burnout, what do I do about it? Yeah, I actually went back to read what I wrote before for some guidance. Therapy, medication, self-care. But experts in workplace burnout have noted before that just doing individual work doesn't really solve much. It solves the exhaustion part of burnout, but not the underlying causes. That requires addressing the bigger system, or what I wrote about back then as a collective approach. So I have to talk about these things with my family, my friends, my boyfriend, my co-parents, my church people. I have to identify the things that are working and celebrate them. And I have to identify the things that aren't working and address them. Since relationship stress has been a big part of my non-work burnout, I've targeted that a lot over the last month. We've talked, we've workshopped, we've adjusted behaviors, we're putting in systems, and that's great for now. But the only way this works in the long term is if we use an iterative approach. It's a fancy word for a series of steps that you repeat over and over, tweaking and improving it with each cycle. So we revisit things. We schedule times for checking in with intentionality. We self-monitor and we monitor each other. We keep talking. We keep looking at what's working, what's great, and things where we can do it better. Sounds a bit stressful, but so far it's working beautifully. I'm more energized in this relationship now than I have been in the past year. So I'm going to start applying that approach to other areas too. Friendships, social structures, even hobbies and leisure activities. I am burned out on being burned out. So I'm going to make some more changes. That's where I am today. I'll check in tomorrow.